I have a glass.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Cuppa Tea with a Vet. And I am here with Chris Furley from Henley Mobile Veterinary Service. So he wasn't able to join us when we tried to do it 2 weeks ago because he had a family emergency, but he has very kindly managed to join us tonight, and I'm absolutely thrilled. So, Chris, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, I run the Henley Mobile Veterinary Service in Henley-on-Thames. I've been doing that for, I think this is year 5 now. We started in May 2016. We were probably the first mobile veterinary service here in this part of the southeast. I think the only other one from memory was one in London, and there was one in the Isle of Wight. But now there are quite a number about. But I figured that there was probably a niche for a service that visited pets at home, because I think, first of all, it's less stressful for the pets themselves, certainly a lot less stressful for the owners. And my career is such that I've always been used to taking the treatment to the animal rather than the other way around. So I'm quite used to carting fairly substantial bits of equipment around the countryside in order to diagnose and treat animals. And also, a lot of animals get terrified when they go to a veterinary clinic. Their behavior changes entirely, and so they feel much more secure and safe if you visit them at home. And by and large, I would say that probably about 80% of my patients don't actually really realize who I am or what I do. They just think I'm a casual visitor coming in. I might pay them a bit more attention than the plumber, looking into their ears and up their nose or whatever. But other than that, he's a harmless guy, and that's the way I like to keep it. So it works well in that respect.
That's really fantastic. It's really nice to see you found a way that works for you as well. And you can really enjoy your work. And as you say, it definitely seems to be an awful lot more mobile veterinary going on at the moment. And it's quite interesting, really, because actually 2016 wasn't that long ago. So that's quite an explosion in a relatively short amount of time. So I just want to also say hi, Barbara, because Barbara's watching from Switzerland. We're very global now. So tell us more about your past, because you sent me your bio and I have to say it was very incredible. Tell me a bit more about what's made you get to this stage. I mean, Singapore vet, zoo vet, that's amazing.
Okay, well, I spent my childhood in East Africa. I was very lucky. So I grew up the first 17 years of my life in the tropics, both in East Africa and in a short period in Jamaica in the Caribbean. But as a child, my childhood memories are places like the Serengeti and the rainforest in Semliki and places like that.
Wow.
When I came to this country when I was a teenager and went to school here, I realized that the other boys at the school spoke English because I could recognize some of the words, but I had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. It was a cultural gap that just took years to cover. I'd never heard of the Beatles. I'd never heard of Manchester United. I hadn't got a clue what they were on about, the British culture, not a clue. So it was very different. And when I was at school, obviously we were studying to go to university, and I never really wanted to be a vet in the first place at all. What I really wanted to do was be a zoologist. And when the time came to applying for university, in those days you had what's called an UCA form, and I wanted to do zoology, which is on page 11 or whatever it was. So I turned to zoology, and there was a list of all the universities that offered zoology courses, and there were, I think from memory, 62 universities offering zoology degrees. So I realized immediately that there was no chance of a job afterwards. You've got 62 universities churning out 200 graduates a year. Chance of finding a job was 0.
Wow, that's
so my eye sort of wandered further up to the page to the letter V, where it came across veterinary medicine. And so I ticked the box for veterinary medicine, and much to my surprise, got in. I had no idea what you actually did in veterinary medicine or what it was all about, but it seemed a good idea at the time,
How fortunate that V and Z were so close to each other.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. What a history. So when did you become fluent in English even? I mean, that's incredible.
Well, no, I was fluent in English as a child. My first language was Swahili, but I was fluent in English. My parents spoke English at home. My mother's a linguist, so she taught me a lot of different languages. But the English as she is spoke, as someone called it, I could, master like any other child. I was, at the same level as everybody else. It's just that the subject matter of the conversation was completely different. And I had no idea what these other boys are talking about. And it was extraordinary. But we have a long history in our family of living overseas. My sister works with refugees for the UN in various countries around the world.
Wow.
And, my daughter teaches climate change in Kuwait. And so we have quite a long history of sort of mixing with cultures, which I think gives you a good perspective. When I graduated, my first job was actually in Germany, funnily enough.
Wow.
And I was there for about 10 minutes and realized that I did actually have to speak German. So it would be helpful to communicate, So I did 5 hours of German a day for 4 months, 2.5 hours in the morning before breakfast and 2.5 hours in the evening. And you use the same technique that Sir Richard Burton used to learn his language. He figured that you could become fluent in a language and working fluency with 3,000 words. And if you learned 3,000 words, verbs, nouns, adjectives, and got the pronunciation right, then you could get across what it was that you needed. So,
wow.
So if you take that approach, that's actually quite a good way of making yourself understood.
That puts me to shame. I love Germany, and I did my GCSE German. I was quite proud of it. And 20 years later, I went to Germany, and I was actually quite shocked how much I could remember, having not spoken it in 20 years. But it stimulated me to go and start learning again. And thanks for technology, we have Duolingo, and I do my daily lesson. But it's only about sort of between 10 minutes.
Each language has its own idiosyncrasies. I mean, you can say things in English that you can't really say in other languages, but you can definitely say things in German that you can't say in other languages. And Arabic has a whole range of different sort of nuances that you can't really translate.
Wow, that's so interesting. So when did you end up in Singapore as the zoo vet there then? When did that happen?
Oh, that was quite recently. That was about 2004. I went there because I worked at Howletts and Port Lymm in Kent for a long while, and then I went to Singapore and worked there as the head vet at Singapore Zoo, which is a big collection, 4,500 animals.
Wow.
We had a staff of, I think the veterinary staff from memory was about 11, and then I was also around the zoology department, which is 160 people. So it's fairly time consuming.
But you got back to your zoology roots.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, that's true. And we funded a lot of conservation projects, and it was good fun. I mean, working with animals that you don't normally come across at all. A lot of quite rare primates over there, a lot of snakes. And we used to get snakes brought in every week by the police. Pythons would wind up in people's kitchens, and they called the police to come and catch them, and then they used to take them to the zoo. So we had a huge collection of pythons.
You couldn't imagine as a policeman over here being rang up, I've got a snake, can you come and get it? And them actually saying yes.
Yeah, they have a snake department.
Wow.
Yeah, with special tongs and nets and stuff, and so that's quite useful.
If anyone's a policeman watching, can you please comment and let us know if you would actually deal with a snake if you were called in? Because I want to know how far your police dedication would go if you were asked to be a policeman and you had to handle the snakes. That's amazing. Wow. So what brought you back here?
Well, I worked after I left Singapore, I went to Thailand and set up my own consultancy, working with wildlife management programs over there. And then I was part of a group here that were involved in property transactions. And I had a phone call one day to say that one of the members of the group had fallen ill and would I come back to the UK and help. So that's really why I came back to the UK. And that was just at the beginning of the sort of credit crunch in this country. Yeah. So nobody had any transactions going through the banks at all. And so that's when I sort of switched careers from being a zoo and wildlife vet to a small animal vet, because medicine's not the sort of subject that you can give up and then go back to after a year. You have to keep practicing on a weekly basis.
Yeah.
Sort of simple things like intravenous cannulas and think that all those skills you lose if you don't practice them.
Yeah.
So I worked as a locum in about 35 practices up and down the country. And some of them are very good and some of them are not so good. But that showed me, the reasons why I set up the mobile service were valid, because I could see a lot of animals were terrified of coming in. I could see that clients were frustrated that every time they went to the vet, they saw a different person. That's the biggest complaint I get now.
Yeah.
Never see the same person twice.
Yeah.
And they get incredibly frustrated if they see somebody on Monday and they're told to call on Thursday, and they call on Thursday and they're told, oh, that vet is off duty till next week. Just drive a wall. Whereas I do everything myself. So the only person they get is me. And if they don't like me, they move on. And if they like me, they stay. So that's the way it works. And I get to know the clients and I get to know the animals. And, we have a wide range of different clientele. We're within commuting distance from London here.
Yeah. So
before the lockdown, I would say probably 1,500 people commuted every day into London from Henley.
Yeah.
And now that's gone down to probably about 200, something like that. So there's a fair sprinkling of people who used to commute a lot, and people who actually used to live and work in Paris and then come home on the Eurostar and spend the weekend in Henley.
Wow.
So different, very, very clientele, from people living in a bedsit on benefits right up to some very wealthy individuals indeed, actually.
I was going to say also that must gel well with your traveling instinct, because you can all talk about your travels because you've got lots of people with lots of itchy feet.
Yeah, some of my staff are British Airways pilots and staff, and others are, working in the oil industry and international agricultural projects, things like that. So there's a fair sprinkling of travelers, as I call them, in this area. I'm sure there are all over the place, but in particular this area we seem to, because we're relatively close to Heathrow, you see.
Yeah, that's true.
So within hopping distance of 25 minutes away, Terminal 3 and 4 and 5, so it's quite easy to get to.
Lovely. Right, I want to get on to some of these comments, because we've got some lovely comments from our wonderful audience. So Barbara, who's our Switzerland lady, she's a physio that I've talked to before. She's lovely. She says, my experience with the mobile vet is also very good. Thank you. That's great. Especially for the last moment in their life of the beloved pet. It was very helpful for the owner and the animal, and the veterinarian comes home. It makes the last step a little easier. I have to say, I completely agree. I think that's one of the moments you've always traditionally wanted the vet to come out, really, anyway, isn't it? That's the one time that you.
Yeah, it means a lot to people. And when I was in practice, I realized that the actual process, the procedure that we use traditionally for putting animals to sleep in the modern way, inverted commas, is actually also quite stressful for the pet.
Yeah.
They're held, the vein is raised and the leg is shaved, and it's all, so that's something which I sort of found rather distasteful, and perhaps could be done in a more elegant manner, to be honest.
That's a nice description of it, actually.
Mm.
So yeah, absolutely. So we've got some more. Jane Lovering has come on and said, I used to be an education officer in a safari park, and we used to have snakes and exotic spiders brought in by the local police officer for identification. Oh wow, that's interesting. That was one brave policeman, but that is interesting to know that that same thing does go on across the pond and in the UK too. And Joanne, oh, you're going to love this. She says, we like you. And she's giving you a hug.
Okay. Hi, Joanne.
Thank you so much for Joanne for saying that. That's really lovely. And Jane Telford has said, I have 3 rescues from Cyprus, which have come with many issues, and Def agree, seeing the same person makes a massive difference.
Mm.
Well said. And it's great you're sharing. Thank you for sharing your experience, Jane. And yeah, Jane has also said a mobile vet would be amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, absolutely. At the end of the day, we all say exactly the same about our local GPs, don't we? You know, in the old days, you always had your same doctor who you knew and you saw all the time. And, you know, those things have changed now. So it is a really, really, yeah, good point. You can't change that. So yeah, it's lovely seeing the same person and getting to have a great relationship with them. And Joanne has also said, Chris recently carried out an operation on our dog Milo using his outdoor pod. No stress of leaving the vets. Oh, wonderful. You have an outdoor pod?
Yeah, since the lockdown began, we do all our surgery and dental procedures either outdoors if the weather's sort of conducive to that, or we have a little outdoor pod, which is a transparent pop-up tent that we can use, and we can, you know, wipe down the inside and sterilize it. We bring all our in table and sterile equipment and everything like that. This means that given the COVID restrictions, we don't share the same airspace as the owner, and the dog is handed over at the door to the pod. So you know, we follow the social distancing guidelines. And it does work quite well. The only slight disadvantage we discovered that if there's a strong breeze, it tends to blow away. So we've had to use some sandbags to tie it down from time to time. But I mean, that's a minor point. But it is a good system. It does work well, and
fantastic.
Like it gives us quite room. It's 12 foot in diameter, so we've got plenty of room to move about. It means we don't have to, you know, share the house with other people while we're doing anything like that. And we do a lot of dental scale and polish and cleaning out ears that can't be, you know, cleaned out when the animal is conscious, and removing sort of skin tumors and things like that. Yeah.
Oh, well done. That's amazing. See, lots of different ways of doing these things. That's absolutely amazing. So Jane has also asked, and this is probably a question more for me, is there a mobile canine physio? Yes, of course there is, Jane. Absolutely. So yes, you just need to give your physios a call and find out, you know, how they work and where they work, and then you'll be able to work out the system that works for you both, basically. Because yes, well, there are a lot of mobile physios, but there are also some that are also in one place. But they're like me, I work in my main location, but then I also go out on home visits for certain cases as well. So it's a case of mix and match. So have a conversation and find out what your needs are. But yes, don't think that it's ruled out at all. So that's wonderful. And Jane has also asked, do you do nutrition consultations?
Up to a point. I'm actually a firm believer in Mother Nature, and I view that the way that we manage and treat some animals as sort of going against nature rather than with it. I think you get a better results if you work with nature rather than against it. So I'm in favor of what I would call sensible feeding. Part of the problem we have in domestic dogs is that they have evolved so differently from their ancestors over the past hundreds of thousands of years that their digestive system is also slightly different. They can digest small amounts of carbohydrate, which canines, you know, wild canines cannot. The other difference is, of course, that we feed them what is effectively processed food. You know, wolves in Alaska don't eat their food out of a packet or a tin. They eat the whole animal, but the vitamins and minerals that don't exist in meat per se, do actually exist in some of the internal organs, but also in the vegetable matter in the intestines of the animal that they prey on. So that's how they pick up minerals and vitamins which are not present in a strictly carnivorous diet, because they eat the whole animal. We tend to forget that.
Yeah.
So I'm a strong proponent of raw food feeding. I think that's I've seen a number of cases where animals, in particular with sort of food intolerance and skin disease, hypersensitivity, things like that, have just blossomed on raw food. It's done really well. There are a number of raw food manufacturers around. I think there's probably about 16 or 20 now, and they do well. And I mean, the establishment doesn't like them, of course, because they're in competition with the big guys. But hey, you know, Microsoft didn't like Apple when they started, and look where Apple is now. So, so I think that if you feed your dog sensibly, then you shouldn't go wrong. But I'm not a nutritionist. But with a little bit of common sense and logic, which seem to be two of the qualities least prevalent in the world today, as far as I could see, it should be possible to, you know, look after a dog healthily without too much trouble.
I think at the end of the day as well, it's a very broad question, isn't it? Like, do you do nutrition consults? Because it depends on what your needs are, isn't it? So, you know, if you have like a specific issue that really needs fixing, then you probably do need you know, well-qualified nutritional advisor. But it's an everyday Joe, you know, puppy nutrition or, you know, weight loss clinic or something like that.
Yeah,
Then
that's right.
You know,
but you know, in some parts of the way I worked in Germany for a while, and there are a lot of husky dog owners over there, and Samoyeds and all these Arctic breeds, and they all eat fish. That's what they're bred to survive on. And you know, huskies in Greenland have fed dried cod pretty much their entire lives, or seal meat, and that is literally what they survive on. So when you bring a husky down to Oxfordshire and start feeding it, you know, kibble or tin dog food or something, you might want to ask, well, should we really be, you know, feeding it fish as well, and to some degree.
It's interesting, isn't it? Lots of thoughts. Definitely. Thank you, Jane. That was an amazing question. And she's also said, one of my Cyprus dogs has a dermatologist, so would be interested in nutrition. Yeah, skin and nutrition links. Yes, that's another big conversation, isn't it?
Yeah, the dermatologist would probably be, you know, fairly good and skilled at giving, you know, good advice on that front. I'm sure that, you know, there would be a lot of information there.
Awesome. And Joanne says, we feed our 3 dogs on a raw diet and are very healthy. Well, that's wonderful to know, Joanne. Well done. Thank you for saying. So you've answered loads of my questions, but so what do you like to do in your spare time? What keeps you ticking in between your vetting?
Well, in my spare time, I have a big book collection. I collect books on natural history and exploration, which I've collected since I was probably about 14, 15. So they're mainly revolving around the tropics, wildlife in the tropics. So that gives me a lot of pleasure. It annoys the hell out of my partner because we've got cardboard boxes full of books everywhere in the house, and in the attic and everywhere. I mean, you can see some of them behind me. So that's one of my sort of main passions is books and wildlife collecting.
Not a Kindle man.
On wildlife. Yeah. Sorry?
Not a Kindle man.
No, there's no, you can't put a value on Kindle. No, I mean, I have a Kindle, but I rarely use it. But the book itself is much more precious in my view.
I completely agree. It's exactly the same in our house. We have a Kindle and it literally is hardly ever used. My husband was determined to have a Kindle, but it never actually really made it out of the box, which is a shame. And then the other thing as well is if you are reading like veterinary stuff or just research papers or whatever, like you can't highlight it. I mean, I know you can highlight it, but it's not the same as like just putting a line through it and then just feeling your way back like you used to do when you had to do your English studies or whatever at school. It's quite bizarre. And actually, I came across my what was it? Lord of the Flies book. There's an old book from when I was studying at school, and I know I can't believe I still have that book, but I think it's just my nostalgia. And I was looking through it, and I was like, all these highlights and all these notes about what everything means, and you're like, yeah, you can't do that on a Kindle. So
no.
it was amazing. Oh, that's really lovely though. And you're very drawn to your tropical side. I'm really surprised that you are residing in the UK, if I'm honest, because I just think it must be freezing for you at the moment. You must be like, where's the heat?
It's not particularly pleasant at the moment. Of course, in the lockdown, I tend to see everybody outside. 2 weeks ago, it was -2. So that was a bit tricky. But hopefully we'll get a decent spring and summer when life will be a bit more enjoyable. I think if Britain generally was about 10 degrees warmer, it would be a much more conducive place to sort of live and develop a career, really.
I agree, except from the fact that we'll probably be there with global warming. Give it time. Shouldn't laugh, really. That's terrible. So you've obviously said about what made you be a vet, and that's just because it was V in the alphabetical order. So that was nice to learn. And what's your favourite part about being a vet? What have you decided actually you do like it for?
Well, I think when I left Germany, I worked in the desert for 6 years in Abu Dhabi Emirate, but we were in the empty quarter. And we were everything there was new. I mean, we had new diseases, or we had diseases that had been recorded, but only in domestic animals, and we had them in the wild. So finding new things like that to me was very exciting. And so we were the first people to record rinderpest in a number of species. We're the first people to record avian pox in golden eagles. And there were a lot of diseases which are familiar, because in those days, in the sort of late 70s and 80s, there were no restrictions on import and export of animals in the UAE. If you wanted to bring in a panda with rabies, no one was going to stop you. Now, of course, it's tightened up a bit, but the importation of animals for the sheikhs' collections in those days used to be massive. And these animals would come from places like Egypt and Sudan and Somalia, where there were no regulations at all. And all the animal dealers were interested in was profit. And we used to get phone calls and go along to the airport to pick up a shipment of animals, and half of them would be dead.
Oh, God, that must be awful.
And I remember one shipment of something like 12 ostriches, and only 2 of them were alive, and all come from Sudan. And you wonder, if 12 ostriches left Sudan alive, how many died before the plane left the ground,
Oh, God, how awful.
That sort of thing really got to me. But I think the fact that we were in a relatively new field, finding new animals and finding new diseases in animals, to me, that was the exciting part. And I've always been interested in infectious disease. And before I went to Singapore, I published a medical journal. I had a publishing company, and we published a medical journal called the Infectious Disease Review. And it was the only journal in the world that published veterinary articles and medical articles and articles about infection in the environment. We brought everything together, and most of our subscribers were hospital libraries and some of the big research centers like Axo Nobel in Sweden and Smithsonian in Washington and people like that. And we had one issue, I remember, on tuberculosis in the Arctic. And there was a medical researcher who wrote about TB in the Inuit in Canada. We had someone else write about TB in whales and seals and walrus. Someone else wrote about avian TB in Arctic birds. And, the whole thing brought a much bigger sort of spectrum of infectious disease in a given part of the world to the audience. And I think the medical profession, because they know nothing about animals at all, they were, massively surprised that, all that amount of work had been done, So
I was going to say, you must have had your mind blown over COVID, because you must have been like, oh, I understand all this.
Well, when it first, I mean, I wasn't the least bit surprised. I mean, I worked in Asia for a long while, and I, worked in China and Indonesia, and coronaviruses are carried by bats and other creatures, but coronaviruses per se as a group only survive really in populations numbering in the hundreds of thousands or millions. So, bats live in roosts of 500,000 individuals upwards.
Wow.
And so it wasn't a surprise that, that had crossed over to the human population somewhere in Southeast China, we imagine. So we believe. And, the human is an aberrant host. We're going to have to live with it now for forever. There'll be other mutations, some of which vaccines will be protective against, and some probably be more problematical. And there'll be other viruses as well cropping up. With every day that passes, the human population increases and the amount of habitat for wildlife decreases. So the interaction between wildlife and humans increases every day. So we're bound to get more episodes like this in the future. I'm quite confident about that, unfortunately.
Yeah, so sad. We need more rewilding, don't we? That's one of my big things.
Well, what we need is somewhere to put animals into. I mean, zoos breed hundreds of thousands of animals a year successfully. And the ultimate aim of every zoo is to be able to return their animals to the wild. I mean, that's lovely, but very few zoos actually do that. And part of the reason is finance and funding and expertise. But the other reason is that very often there's nowhere to put them.
Yeah.
Which is safe.
Yeah.
And, if you return elephants to Nigeria, within 5 years, they'll all be dead. So the protective areas need to be much, much more stringently managed.
Yeah.
And that includes veterinary work too. I mean, in Africa, there are a lot of field vets, and in South America, who work with wildlife and are producing a much bigger picture of some of the diseases which are prevalent in wildlife. We have avian malaria, for example, in penguins in the Antarctic. That's a major problem.
Wow.
And the aspergillosis is a problem in penguins. I'll tell you a funny story about penguins. When I worked in Abu Dhabi, we had at the zoo there, we had a big aquarium, and we had a group of Humboldt penguins, and one of them died with aspergillosis of the lungs, which is a fungal disease.
Oh, yeah.
And then we had another penguin which sort of didn't look very well. So I used to take some of my animals from the zoo to the local hospital, which was American staffed. And so it was all very highly qualified. And the guy in charge of the X-ray department was actually Scottish, Chris Austin. And I used to take falcons there and tiger cubs and things like that. And he always used to ask me to come at 6 o'clock in the evening and knock on the back door when all the other sort of human patients had gone, and he and his staff would help me. And one day I used to call him. I called him up and I said, "Look, I've got a penguin to bring in and a falcon at 6 o'clock. Would that be okay?" He said, "Yeah, fine." So when we got round to actually catching this penguin at 5 o'clock, we couldn't catch it. This thing shot like a bullet through the water, and there was no way that we could catch this thing. So I thought, well, forget it. We'll leave the penguin, just take the falcon. So we arrived at the hospital and knocked on the back door at 6 o'clock with one falcon. And Chris Austin himself opened the door and he looked at me and he said, "Where's the penguin?" I said, "We couldn't catch it." And he went white as a sheet. I said, "What's the problem?" And he said, I've bet half the hospital staff £10 each that there'll be a penguin in the X-ray department at 6 o'clock. So he lost like £600 or something on a bet that went wrong, because nobody believed him. So they all took him up on his bet. So I felt really bad about that. Yeah, I felt bad about that. Yeah.
Well, that'll teach you. Gambling off. Oh, bless. Well, I'm just going to pop Barbara's comment on here as well, because Barbara has said, totally good point. How do you see it? I always worry when customers fly with their dogs. All of these many diseases, heartworm and more, we never go abroad with the dog. Yeah, that's obviously touching back on when you were saying about the ostrich arriving, obviously.
Well, yeah, I mean, the regulations for traveling animals and transporting animals by air now are extremely strict. And if your crate and your paperwork doesn't match the regulations, then, the animal doesn't fly. It's very simple. The health requirements on either side of, departure and destination are usually fairly strict as well. I mean, in the last 20 years, we've seen huge advances in trying to control the spread of infectious disease. There is an issue with rescue dogs coming from places like Romania and Bulgaria, Turkey, places like that, where they are exposed to some diseases which we don't have in this country. And so making sure that these animals are clear of those diseases before they arrive here is, pretty important. But the rescue centers out there, they do a good job, and most of the veterinary officials are pretty skilled and knowledgeable, and certainly from the paperwork I've seen, they've always been very efficient. So, but there's always that risk that if you take your dog abroad, it might pick up something, it might get bitten by a tick or something and carry a blood parasite that you know nothing about, and that's part of life. But having said that, when a human goes abroad, I mean, we could go to Greece on holiday and pick up something that we didn't expect and bring it back to this country. It's just the same for us.
That's true. You just don't think about it, do you? Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. But yeah, it's a lot to think about when you're traveling your dog abroad, and it's not an easy task. I know that doing the vet passports was always a bad thing when I was a nurse, and as in, everybody hated it. And I think my understanding is that that's only got worse. So that's not easy. So tell me a bit more about your team. So, do you have any help that you have work with you, or are you literally a one-man band and that's it?
I'm pretty much a one-man band. I use the services of a company that answers the phone, and they will contact me by email. So I get emails every day saying, Mrs. Thompson called at 4 o'clock. Here's a number. Can you please call back about so and so? But that's pretty much what they do. That's all they do. They don't speak to me very much. But I call the clients. I make the appointments. I go and visit them. I dispense all the medication. I order all the medication, dispense it, do all the invoicing, chase it all up, send out all the paperwork that needs to be sent anywhere. And initially, when we began, we didn't have any clients at all. So there was no work whatsoever. And now we've got several hundred clients. And the average, yesterday was an average day where we probably began at 7:30 and finished maybe about 10:15.
Wow.
So today I shifted to, yeah.
Wow. Well done you managing. I mean, you are literally, as they say, chief bottle
washer. Yeah.
So,
yeah. I have 3 sort of part-time staff who help me with dental procedures and things like that. They're not nurses per se, but one of them is a dog walker, so she's handled dogs all her life. The other one's a cat sitter, looks after people's cats when they're away on holiday. So as you can imagine, at the moment, she hasn't got much to do. But these are people who are used to handling animals, and sometimes quite fractious animals. And then I also have someone who helps me who's an airline pilot with BA.
Oh, wow.
So between the 3, I think there's 4 of them actually. So depending on the type of animal that we're dealing with, they're all pretty well trained in their own sort of field now and quite skilled at it. So, we're super careful about what they do. And essentially, they don't actually really handle the animals at all, to be honest. I do all of that. But they help sort of put things on the table and set up the equipment and stuff like that.
On the job learning, always helpful. So I always like to ask, what do you love about physio?
Well, physio, I think, is probably the forgotten skill, because I think that particularly animals recovering from surgery, where they've had surgery on a limb or the backbone or something like that, very often will suffer from muscle atrophy, and if you don't use it, you'll lose it.
Yep.
And I've seen a number of cases where animals have been off and had the most amazing bits of complex surgery, and it's all terribly wonderful, and they come home, but 4 months later they're still lame because they haven't been told how to use that limb properly, and they're still sort of hopping about.
Yep.
So I think physio is probably, certainly in the experience I've had, it's been useful helping animals recuperate, but it's also actually quite useful for animals that have arthritis, animals which have never had surgery but have arthritis and are in pain. It's useful to have physio to try and just generally ease that tense musculature down the spine and around the hip area and so on. And that helps just to make life more comfortable for them. And I do actually tell my clients sometimes to do that. And so I had one family with a dog that was sort of very stiff, and they had 8 people in the family. So I drew up a rota and I put all of them on duty for half an hour, starting at 7:30 in the morning.
Oh,
And
wow.
they all had to take the dog for a 5-minute walk and do a bit of rehab and so on for about a week. And at the end of the week, the dog had recovered, considerably. It wasn't totally
Fantastic.
100%. It was vastly improved. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I could not have said it better myself. You've touched all the points in my view. I mean, that's exactly it. And I'm thrilled to hear that you have had a situation where you have put them on that type of regime that will help. I mean, yeah, absolutely. 5 minutes, 4 times a day is like one of the best regimes you can have for walking when you've got a problem like this. And yeah, and obviously then build from that. And you're absolutely right. It is a team effort. And with the whole family getting involved, it does reduce the burden on the caregiver. And that is such a big thing, because it is hard work. It is hard work. But obviously the best results are when you are all involved. So the bigger your team, the easier it is. So yeah, well done. That sounds fantastic. And I'm thrilled that there was a good result at the end of it. And more importantly, the dog will have been thrilled and the family will have been thrilled. So yeah, well done. I'm thrilled that you're on board with the physio and you're loving it. So that's amazing. So I always like to ask as well, what part of being a vet still grosses you out? Because I feel like you're going to say nothing. I'm hardcore because I've been traveled the world and seen everything, but there must be something that you felt bleh.
Well, I don't like cruelty to animals.
Of course, yeah.
And that does upset me. And that you may recall, was it last year or maybe even the year before, that there was a young policeman who was killed near Oxford. He was dragged under a car by some travellers.
Yes.
Killed, and there was a big row about it. Anyway, the next Saturday I had a call from the RSPCA to see if I would go to the sort of camp where these people lived, apparently.
Oh.
And so I went down there, and they had it was a puppy breeding outfit. They had a lot of dogs there, French bulldogs. They also had some fighting cocks there, which were breeding. And there were also a number of other animals which didn't fit in the picture at all. There was a young husky puppy there, was obviously been stolen. There was a boxer there, which I think had also been stolen. The place was overrun with rats and things like that. But there was a degree of animal cruelty which was totally unnecessary. And that sort of thing really does make me angry, because at some point mankind will have to answer to our maker for the way that we've treated the animal kingdom. We really will. Yeah. I don't know when that will be, but it's time, I think, to take on board, perhaps a different viewpoint. And having worked overseas, animals in this country are actually quite lucky, because there is legislation here to protect them. And, nobody likes to have cosmetics and drugs and things tested on animals. I don't either. But unless the law is changed, then that's what's going to happen. But I'd far rather that they were tested on animals in Europe, where the animal welfare regulations are very high, rather than other countries that I could mention where there are no regulations at all and the animals suffer terribly. So yeah. I'm not in favor of animal testing at all, but given the choice, I would prefer that they were done somewhere like Europe or the States, where it is regulated, inspected, and if you fall short of the standards, then you're closed down.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think absolutely everybody who's watching will be thinking exactly the same, that they can't handle it, hate seeing it, can't stand any RSPCA adverts. And yeah, and when you've been in this industry, you've always seen way too much. I always say, properly PTSD from the things you've seen in the past are just horrendous. And but you're right, we are getting better, but there is so much further to go. And even when there are legislations, they're often not good enough. And then and again, there's always the people that just don't care if there's legislation because they're doing their own thing, like these people you were called to. So it is awful. I am heartened when I find out that there are countries that you think don't have legislation, and then you find out they actually do. That's quite nice, but it is never policed or rarely policed. So
it's rarely enforced. And you may or may not recall that when President Carter was president of the USA, one of the templates of his foreign policy was human rights. And so if you're a country that held your values and respected human rights and followed the UN Charter and so on, then you were regarded as a friend of the states and had special trading facilities and so on. And if you weren't, you didn't. But no one has done the same for animal rights. No government has come out and said, well, how do you treat your animals? Do we really want to do business with you? Nobody. And if you look around the governments of the world, there isn't one single politician who is a leader of a government who has a degree in any of the subjects of life sciences at all. They're all career politicians with degrees in economics and God knows what. There isn't a single biologist who's president of anywhere who would say, hey guys, we've got to protect our indigenous areas. And I mean, Costa Rica has a fantastic government in terms of conservation. But that's because conservation brings in money. Tourism is a massive, money spinner for Costa Rica, and quite rightly so. But they protect their areas very well. And that very often for some countries that I've worked in, like the Congo and places like that, that is the only reason why conservation is followed by the government, is because they think it will bring in money. Otherwise, they just simply don't care.
Well, Chris, you're going to have to get a UN veterinary chair, and you can stand for the UN and try to get the animals looked after. And it shouldn't even be funny, because that sounds like such an amazing thing, and especially with your world experience. And we had Danny Chambers on a couple of months ago, and he obviously has stood for trying to be an MP, and he's a vet. And so, yeah, it would be amazing if we could get some, like you say, some people higher up that actually can make it there. Unfortunately, he didn't quite make it, but I'm sure he'll keep trying, and that would be amazing, because
let's hope so.
We need to get more veterinary there. You're absolutely right. And I mean, you do feel like you're banging your head on a brick wall, because you're forever signing petitions, and you feel like that's the best you can do, because you don't know what else to do. And so it's amazing when you hear people like you, who obviously have a lot more experience and knowledge about what needs to happen to make these changes. So I think all we can do is encourage people like you to go and talk to the UN and fix it for all of us. That would be absolutely amazing. Because
if the opportunity arises, I can promise you I will. But whether or not that happens, I really don't know.
Well, we'll see what we can do. If anyone's watching and has any influence in all the right places, please know that Chris will go and work for the UN. That would be amazing. So this is a great question. So what if time and money was no object, what would be your dream achievement?
What, starting something from scratch, you mean?
Whatever you want it to be. What would you love to do? What have you always had a burning desire in your heart to achieve?
If time and money were no object, I would set up a merchant trading bank and use the profits to protect the environment.
Oh, nice.
So we would use the greed of the human species to protect planet Earth.
That sounds amazing. And it sounds like
the lottery, that's what I would do.
It does sound like you've thought about that. Have you got a little plan in your head?
It's been there for a while, yeah.
Right. Again, anybody watching who's got the money to finance this idea, talk to Chris, because it sounds wonderful. And absolutely any ideas that can come out that help the environment, I think would be absolutely amazing. So, yeah. Oh, that's a really lovely goal. I like that idea. Like that. And so if you could have a Facebook Live, like I'm doing with you now, with anybody, dead or alive, who would they be and why?
Well, I'd probably want to do it with I can't remember his name now, Dawkins, who wrote The Selfish Gene. He has explained, he was, I think, professor of public science or something at Oxford. Richard Dawkins, that's his name. And he's the first person really to explain in very simple terms about evolution and the way that life on planet Earth has evolved and the way that we all interact with each other, and in particular, how things have developed by chance, and with an explanation for pretty much everything that happens in the natural world, in contrast to what some religions have put forward, which is obviously the idea of creationism and this so on. And so I admire him tremendously. I think he's done an awful lot of good work, Richard Dawkins. And I'm a firm adherent to Charles Darwin. Some of those books behind me are Darwin material. And I used to know a guy called Quentin Keynes, who was Charles Darwin's great nephew, who had a first edition of all Darwin's books.
Wow.
Yeah. And he's dead now, unfortunately, but they were sold at auction for Christie's for a lot of money. So I think that he was probably one of the great figures that mankind has produced, because it has influenced our lives irreparably, and the discovery of DNA sort of backed it up. So that really has come full circle. So no longer do we rely on superstition and belief, we rely on scientific fact. And I think that has immeasurably improved the way that we live, the values that we hold, and the way that we interact with the environment.
Absolutely. That's so amazing.
Think, if you don't understand something, then you won't respect it. If you don't respect it, you won't protect it. And it's very true of all walks of life. So if I were to have a Facebook one-to-one with anyone, it would probably be Richard Dawkins. I'd give him a good grilling and find out what makes him tick. Yeah, and like me, he's from Kenya. So
wow.
He spent his childhood in Kenya. Apparently, I discovered years ago. Yeah,
I do love learning about people's past, and not necessarily from the same. Yeah, you just pick things out from different places that you've been to, don't you? So I visited Darwin's house, and I have to say a lot of the facts I learnt there blew my mind completely. How old his wife was when she popped out her last baby, still unbelievable. Yeah. I can't even repeat it because I think it's so unreal. Yeah. But I watched the film Miss Potter just the other day, and there was also some facts in there about Beatrix Potter, and I was like, mind blown. Some incredible people out there, and it's so interesting. Barbara has also just jumped in to say thank you very much, that was interesting, and stay healthy. So thank you, Barbara, for saying that. I think she's probably popping off now, which is fair enough. Oh, it's Switzerland, so whole different time scale there.
Quite late.
Yes, exactly. So I feel like we know so much about you now, so I don't know what else you can have, but I would love to ask, tell us something that people don't know about you. Awkward one.
People don't know about me.
Yeah, secret. Nice juicy one.
I actually stood for Parliament once.
Oh wow!
I think it was when John Major was Prime Minister, or his term was coming to an end, and it was a party that was formed online. It wasn't a Tory Conservative or anything like that. It was an online party funded by a millionaire, and they were looking for candidates for all sorts of different constituencies. And I was working in a clinic near Cuffley at that point, and I was bored stiff. So I thought, well, I'll do this, can't be that difficult. So I put my name down and said, I'll be a candidate for this constituency. And they said, wonderful, and I had a big questionnaire to fill in about, what were my views on, pensions, the National Health Service, and various other bits and pieces. And then I didn't really hear anything from them at all. I was never asked to sort of give any speeches or attend any hustings or anything. And then about 10 days before the election proper, suddenly there was a flurry of emails that said, oh, we've had our market research people come back to us and they think we're going to do really well in this election. And if we win the election, what position would you like? So I thought, well, that's a pretty interesting question. So I thought, well, if it's not, too much trouble with you guys, I'd quite like to be foreign secretary. So only in jest. So I sent this email off, and then I got a very non-committal response back saying, well, thank you for your, we'll certainly think about that one. And that was the last I ever heard of them. I discovered after the election that I think I had got 14 votes. And the most successful candidate for this party had got 280.
Wow.
So the party was an absolute complete dead flop. I can't even remember the name of the party, I'm afraid. But it was an interesting idea at the time, yeah.
It sounds like that was an amazing experience. And how bizarre that you only got contacted because the market research people were, it seems so backwards to make the decision like that. How bizarre.
It was a total cowboy outfit, but it was quite fun to be part of, I must confess, yeah.
Well, then that's the important bit, isn't it? And if anyone can say politics is fun, then, well, I think you've won there. So Doreen has popped up and said, what an amazing gentleman. I was born and brought up in, oh no, I'm not going to be able to pronounce that. Kitwe. And then a new lovely mobile vet, namely Paddy Davidson, who cared for wildlife at his home. There was often lion cubs he would rear, and when the mother had died. Well done, both of you. Oh, thank you, Doreen. Thank you so much for bringing that up, that story. That was really kind of you. So and what a lovely compliment. So what's the most spontaneous thing you've ever done? Because is that going to be the Parliament thing as well, or have you done something else?
The most spontaneous thing. Blimey. I once bought a marble company in Italy.
What? So random.
Yeah. And they'd advertise for investors in the Financial Times. So I thought, well, that looks interesting. I've always been a fan of Michelangelo and the Italian Renaissance. So I went down to Italy the next afternoon and bought a third of a marble company.
That is mad. Well, that definitely ticks spontaneous. Well done.
So that meant that I had to go to Italy 4 times a year and have the most enormous lunches with staff, I used to starve myself for 2 days before I went, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to fit in the aircraft seat on the way home. It was out of this world, but it was very interesting. It was a totally different way of life and quite interesting. Yeah, in the Carrara Mountains north of Pisa. Yeah.
How amazing. Well, that is very cool. It's been absolutely amazing learning about you and your life. And so I've just got one final question. So everybody, to give them a tip, what would be your top tip for dealing with pain?
Do you mean physical pain or emotional pain?
Oh, let's go with either, whichever you want.
Top tip for dealing with pain. I think, certainly in my experience, putting pain on a shelf and giving it a name is actually quite a useful way to handle it. If you're in pain because emotional pain, if you just give it a name and then you say, well, Nesta's on the shelf at the moment, I'll come back to him tomorrow and have a chat with him. That kind of separates it from your personality and you can get on with the rest of the day.
That's interesting.
Or if you're in physical pain, then again, you can sort of concentrate on the things that you are physically capable of doing before you get back to trying to heal yourself from, whatever's, causing physical pain. And I know that that's what I've broken a lot of bones in my time, and that's the system that I learned to use, and it has worked well. So.
That's fantastic. That sounds like an amazing tip. So I really like that. So top tip for dealing with pain, emotional, physical, give it a name, pop it on the shelf. I like that. Joanne has also said thank you. And I'm also going to wrap this up now and say thank you so much to everybody for watching. You've been an amazing audience. Thank you so much for your amazing participation. And thank you so much, Chris, for joining me and having this interview. I can't believe how incredibly interesting you have been, and it's been wonderful to have you.
Well, you're very kind. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.